To understand why this single image is so jarring, so fundamentally disruptive to our historical memory of the Second World War, one must first erase the comfortable certainties of old documentaries and replace them with the brutal binary reality of the Eastern Front. This was not a war of nuanced ideologies fought from a distance. It was a clash of existential annihilation, a meat grinder stretching from the Arctic to the Caucasus, where the very soil seemed to ferment with hatred. It was a conflict where the concept of chivalry died in the snow outside Moscow, and the line between soldier and savage was often blurred by the need to survive until the next sunrise. In this context, the tank was not merely a vehicle. It was a steel avatar of national will, a moving fortress whose silhouette evoked immediate, visceral responses. For a Soviet infantryman, the low, sleek profile of a German panzer emerging from the smoke was a sight that tightened the chest and sent a cold jolt of adrenaline through the veins. Its grinding tracks and the sharp bark of its main gun were the soundtrack of an advancing hell. Conversely, for a German soldier, the hulking, pragmatic form of a T-34 was a symbol of an inexorable, seemingly endless tide of industrial might, a tide that threatened to drown the entire Reich. This is why the photograph is impossible. It shatters this iconography. It shows a group of Soviet soldiers, their posture relaxed, their faces bearing the hardened, familiar expressions of the Red Army's tankers, not perched on their own T-34 or KV-1, but lounging casually on the cold, gray steel of a German Panzerkampfwagen IV. The Bokenkreuz, the stark black cross of the Wehrmacht, is visibly marked on the hull, a symbol of the enemy now serving as a backdrop for their rest. The location, as the caption chillingly notes, is Berlin. The date is March 1943. The immediate, instinctual reaction of any historian or enthusiast is to find the error. The date must be wrong. The location must be misidentified. It is a simple matter of chronology and geography, the unyielding facts of the campaign map. In March of 1943, the Red Army was still locked in the titanic, bloody struggle to recover from the devastating German advances of the previous years and to capitalize on the stunning victory at Stalingrad. The front line was hundreds of kilometers to the east, running through the shattered cities and scorched earth of Ukraine and southern Russia. The Battle of Kursk, the great armored clash that would come to define the summer of 1943, was still months in the future. The notion of a Soviet tank crew, let alone one in a captured German vehicle, being in Berlin at this time is not just improbable. It is a historical absurdity. Berlin was the heart of the Reich, a distant, heavily defended citadel, its skies still safe, its suburbs untouched by the reality of the Eastern Front. This chronological dissonance is the first layer of the photograph's impossibility. It places the subject in a time and place where it simply could not be, creating a cognitive rift. It is like finding a photograph of a medieval knight standing atop a skyscraper. The elements are recognizable, but their conjunction defies the logical order of the world. Yet, the photograph exists. It is not a modern forgery or a clever piece of propaganda montage from the era. The grain, the lighting, the wear on the uniforms, and the very authenticity of the soldiers' nonchalant poses all attest to its genuineness. This forces us to confront a different possibility: that our understanding, our neat timeline of the war, is incomplete. The caption is not wrong. Our interpretation of it is. The key lies not in reading Berlin, March 1943 as a geographic and temporal fact, but as a piece of data inscribed on the back of the photograph by a clerk, a censor, or perhaps the photographer himself long after the shutter clicked. Berlin could refer to the unit's designation, not the city. There were collective farms, villages, and even state farms named Berlin, founded by German Mennonite settlers in Ukraine and southern Russia throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. A Soviet soldier writing a hasty caption would naturally refer to his location by its official name on the map. For him, he was in Berlin, even if that Berlin was a small, dusty settlement on the vast Ukrainian steppe, a world away from the German capital. Similarly, March 1943 could be a misdating. It could have been developed and catalogued weeks or even months after the film was exposed. In the chaos of a mobile front, with units constantly moving, merging, and being resupplied, meticulous record-keeping was often a secondary concern to survival. A film canister developed in March might contain images from a pivotal action in late February, during the final, chaotic stages of the Stalingrad counteroffensives or the subsequent push toward Kharkov. Therefore, the impossibility of the photograph melts away when we apply the friction of reality to the pristine facts of the caption. It does not show Soviets in the heart of Germany a year and a half before it was possible. Instead, it captures something far more psychologically complex and historically significant. A moment of supreme irony in the most brutal theater of the war. It shows the victors of a small, localized battle not only using the tools of their defeated enemy but doing so with an air of casual ownership. They have not just captured a tank. They have domesticated a symbol of their own terror. They have turned the predator's weapon against the predator. This image, then, is not a historical error. It is a key. It unlocks a hidden narrative of the Eastern Front, a story not of monolithic armies clashing in straightforward opposition, but of a desperate, innovative, and brutally pragmatic war where anything that could be used to survive and kill was pressed into service. The photograph is the gateway to the story of the Soviet Union's most unorthodox weapon, the captured Panzer, and the audacious men who crewed it. This is the story of the Iron Cuckoos, who laid their eggs in the enemy's nest. To comprehend the existence of a Soviet crewed Panzer IV, one must first abandon the conventional framework of warfare as practiced in the West. The war in North Africa and the eventual campaign in Western Europe, for all their destruction, maintained a certain thread of military formalism, a structure influenced by international conventions and a different, albeit still brutal, scale of ideological conflict. The Eastern Front was something else entirely. It was a primordial struggle, a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation, decreed from the highest levels of the Nazi regime and met with a ferocious, totalizing resistance by the Soviet Union. In this cauldron, where millions were grist for the mill, a simple, brutal pragmatism emerged as the highest virtue. This was the unwritten rule. Use what works. Take what you can. Survive. The most immediate and pressing manifestation of this rule was the chronic, crippling shortage of everything. While Soviet propaganda extolled the virtues of the T-34 and the relentless output of the Urals factories, the reality for frontline units was often one of scarcity. Tanks broke down after hundreds of kilometers of brutal use, their engines worn, their tracks shattered by shellfire and frozen ground. Replacement parts could be weeks away, and new tanks were prioritized for major offensives. A battalion might start an operation with 40 tanks and be reduced to a handful of operable machines within days, the rest littering the landscape as burned-out hulks or mechanical casualties. In this context, a disabled vehicle, any vehicle, was not just a piece of lost equipment. It was a coffin for its crew's mobility and a direct reduction in a unit's combat power. This scarcity gave birth to a unique and vital frontline institution, the Trofeinaio Triady, the trophy teams. These were not simple scavengers. They were specialized, highly skilled units of engineers, mechanics, and drivers, often operating under direct fire. Their mission was as dangerous as it was unglamorous: to venture into the no-man's land of a recent battle, assess the wrecked and abandoned hardware of both sides, and salvage anything of value. A crate of German machine gun ammunition was a prize. A functional radio was treasure. A disabled but reparable artillery piece could be dragged back to serve again. And a tank, especially an enemy tank, was the ultimate trophy. The psychology of using the enemy's own weapons ran deep. For a Red Army soldier whose comrade might have been killed by a Panzer IV, the act of climbing inside that very machine was a profound form of psychological conquest. It was the ultimate humiliation of the foe, to not only defeat him but to then use his own finely engineered weaponry, the very symbol of his technological and ideological superiority, against him. It stripped the Wehrmacht of its invincibility. The Panzer, a terrifying beast when advancing with crosses on its flank, became just a machine, a tool, when operated by a Soviet crew. It was a tangible demonstration that the German war machine was not only beatable but could be co-opted. Its power turned back on its creators. This practice, however, was born of more than just spite or a desire for symbolic victory. It was a matter of tactical necessity. A captured Panzer IV offered unique and immediate advantages. Firstly, it was there. While a unit might wait weeks for a replacement T-34 from the rear, a trophy tank could be repaired on the spot by skilled mechanics using cannibalized parts from other wrecks. It provided instant, battle-ready combat power at the very moment it was needed most. Secondly, it possessed inherent tactical value. The Panzer IV, particularly the later models like the OSV G or H with their long 75mm KWK-40 guns, were excellent tank killers. In certain situations, they were superior to the contemporary T-34-76 in terms of optics, gun accuracy, and crew comfort. A Soviet commander who could field a Panzer IV alongside his T-34s gained a versatile and potent weapon. Its German optics provided a clearer view of the battlefield, and its radio equipment, often more reliable and widespread than early war Soviet models, enhanced command and control. Finally, there was the element of deception, the genesis of the Iron Cuckoo tactic. A German tank moving along a road or appearing on a flank would not immediately draw fire. It could be mistaken for a returning reconnaissance patrol or a unit shifting positions. This granted the crew a precious, often decisive, few seconds of ambiguity. They could approach enemy positions, identify targets, and unleash a devastating first salvo before the enemy realized their true allegiance. In the chaos of a fluid battle, where identification was difficult and friend or foe decisions were made in a heartbeat, this deception was a weapon in itself. This unwritten rule of pragmatic appropriation was tacitly accepted, and at times officially encouraged. While there was no initial field manual for operating captured German tanks, the practice became so widespread that higher command could not ignore its benefits. It was a grassroots solution to a problem of existential scale, a testament to the adaptability and raw survival instinct of the Red Army soldier. It was this environment, this desperate, resource-starved, and brutally practical reality, that made the photograph of the Soviet crew on their Panzer IV not an anomaly, but an inevitability. They were not merely following orders. They were living by the fundamental law of the Eastern Front: survive by any means and turn the enemy's strength into his greatest weakness. To the Soviet soldier staring down its barrel in 1941, the Panzerkampfwagen IV was the archetypal German tank. It was not the most numerous, that distinction fell to the lighter Panzer III, but it was the backbone, the steady workhorse around which the German panzer divisions were built. Its design was a product of a different military philosophy, one that emphasized communication, coordination, and the quality of each individual machine. In the early war years, this philosophy, embodied by the Panzer IV, delivered devastating blows. The tank's silhouette was purposeful and formidable. Where the Soviet T-34 was a masterpiece of sloped armor and holistic design, the Panzer IV was a study in Teutonic angularity. Its vertical surfaces and boxy hull were a testament to its pre-war origins, a design that had been progressively upgraded rather than revolutionized. This was both a weakness and a strength. It lacked the T-34's inherent defensive geometry, but it provided a spacious, functional fighting compartment. For a crew of 5, this space was not a luxury. It was a critical component of combat effectiveness. A crew that could move without constant bruising, that could access ammunition and operate controls without a contortionist's skill, was a crew that could fight longer and more accurately. Its early role was that of a support tank, the Begleitpanzer. Armed with a short-barreled 75mm KWK-37 howitzer, it was designed to engage fortifications and infantry positions, laying down high-explosive shells while the Panzer IIIs with their higher-velocity anti-tank guns dealt with enemy armor. The low muzzle velocity of its gun gave it a distinctive, hollow thump, a sound that became synonymous with the Blitzkrieg's opening blows against entrenched positions. But the Eastern Front was a brutal teacher. The shocking encounter with the T-34 and the KV-1 in the summer of 1941 sent a tremor through the German tank corps. Their standard anti-tank guns simply bounced off the Soviet armor. The Panzer IV, in its current form, was suddenly obsolete in the tank-killing role. This was the moment that defined the machine's entire legacy. Instead of being phased out, it was transformed. The response was the Panzer IV OSV, F2, and later the definitive OSV, G and H. The crucial modification was the replacement of the short howitzer with the long, deadly 75mm KWK-40 gun. This was not merely an upgrade, it was a metamorphosis. The tank shed its supportive role and became a primary hunter. The long barrel, with its distinctive single-baffle muzzle brake, gave the Panzer IV a new, menacing profile. The KWK-40 could punch through the armor of a T-34 at respectable combat ranges, restoring a crucial parity on the battlefield. This new beast was a system of interlocking efficiencies. Its optics, the Zeiss scopes used by the gunner and commander, were superlative. They offered clarity and magnification that allowed German crews, and later their Soviet captors, to identify and engage targets at distances where the Soviets were effectively blind. The tank featured a sophisticated intercom system and a powerful FUG-5 radio, a piece of equipment so standard in German tanks and so rare in early war Soviet ones that it fundamentally altered tactical dynamics. A German platoon could maneuver as a coordinated unit, A Soviet platoon often had to follow the leader. Yet, for all its qualities, the Panzer IV was a complex machine. Its propulsion was provided by a Maybach HL-1 20TRM V12 gasoline engine, a powerful but temperamental piece of engineering that required meticulous maintenance. Its final drive units were a known weakness, prone to failure under the stress of the Russian mud and harsh climate. Its narrow tracks, designed for the good roads of Western Europe, gave it a higher ground pressure than the T-34, making it more susceptible to bogging down in the autumn Rasputitsa and deep winter snow. When a Soviet trophy team examined a captured Panzer IV, they saw this duality. They saw the robust welding, the quality of the steel, the exquisite optics, and the powerful gun, a weapon they knew could destroy their own tanks. But they also saw the mechanical complexity, the parts that were foreign to their experience, the engine that demanded high-octane fuel. They saw, in essence, a magnificent weapon, but one born of a different industrial logic. To master this beast was to not only acquire a powerful tank, but to understand the mind of the enemy who built it. It was to turn German quality and complexity against itself, a task for which the brutally pragmatic soldiers of the Red Army were uniquely suited. The journey of a Panzerkampfwagen IV from a feared instrument of the Wehrmacht to a prized asset of the Red Army began not in a quiet workshop, but in the chaotic, corpse-strewn limbo of the battlefield. A tank did not simply surrender itself. It had to be won, and the process of its capture was a brutal lottery of violence, chance, and technical audacity. The moment of its disabling was merely the opening of a new, equally dangerous chapter in the life of the machine. The most common path to capture was not a heroic duel, but a stroke of debilitating luck or a well-placed shot that avoided a catastrophic kill. A high-explosive shell from an anti-tank gun or a tank could strike the track, shearing the delicate steel pins and links, immobilizing the beast instantly. A smaller caliber round from an anti-tank rifle might find a lucky angle, jamming the turret ring and turning the powerful gun into a fixed, useless piece of metal. Shrapnel from an artillery barrage could perforate the thinner engine decking, severing fuel lines or damaging the radiator, causing the engine to seize after a few final, choking revolutions. In these moments, the Panzer IV was not a burning tomb, but a wounded animal vulnerable and trapped. For the German crew inside, this was the critical juncture. The doctrine was clear. A tank that could not be recovered must be denied to the enemy. Standard procedure was to activate a scuttling charge, a dedicated explosive device often stored for this purpose, or to use a hand grenade in the fighting compartment to destroy the radio and the gun's firing mechanism. But doctrine often crumbled in the face of human survival instinct. In the heat of a losing battle under intense machine gun and mortar fire, the imperative to abandon a disabled tank could override the duty to destroy it. A crew would blow the hatches, scramble into the open, and run for their lives, leaving their vehicle largely intact behind them. It was this desperate human act of self-preservation that gifted the Red Army its greatest trophies. This is where the real work began. The battlefield would fall into an uneasy, post-climax silence, punctuated by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of burning wrecks. Into this grim landscape moved the unsung heroes of this story, the Trofeinaio Triady, the trophy teams. These men were a special breed, part mechanic, part scavenger, part combat engineer. Their mission was one of the war's most perilous, to venture into no man's land, often under the threat of sniper fire or a sudden counterattack, and to conduct a triage of the metallic dead and wounded. Approaching a captured Panzer IV was a tense, methodical ritual. First, they checked for booby traps, grenades wired to hatches, or a timed scuttling charge the fleeing crew might have set. Then came the assessment. Was the hull structurally sound? Was the turret functional? The engine was the key. A mechanic would listen, cranking it over. A seized engine was a death sentence for the prize. A damaged track or a minor electrical fire, however, was a reprieve. These were problems that could be solved. The recovery itself was a feat of sheer brute force and ingenuity. If the tank could not move under its own power, it had to be dragged. This often fell to the stalwart of the Red Army, the Stalinets agricultural tractor, pressed into service as a heavy artillery and tank retriever. Chained to the immobilized panzer, it would strain and belch black smoke, inching the G-Serdun of German steel back toward Soviet lines. Every meter gained was a victory, a tangible reversal of the German advances of 1941. They were stealing back the very tools of their own subjugation. Once behind the relative safety of the front, the Panzer IV ceased to be a battle relic and became a complex engineering puzzle. Soviet mechanics, renowned for their resourcefulness, swarmed over it. Their task was not just to repair it, but to translate it. German manuals were non-existent. Every system had to be reverse-engineered through trial and error. They learned the quirks of the Maybach engine, the specific fuel it craved, the strange electrical system that powered the turret traverse. Missing parts were cannibalized from other, less fortunate wrecks, creating a macabre patchwork of German components. This phase of the process transformed the tank. The external markings were the first to go. The Balkenkreuz was painted over or scrubbed away with crude solvents. In its place, bold, white patriotic slogans were often hand-painted on the hull, "For the Motherland," or "Death to the Fascists." The most crucial internal modification was the radio. The sophisticated German Fug 5 set was often removed and sent to intelligence units for analysis, to be replaced by a standard Soviet set, ensuring the crew could communicate with their commanders. In this way, the machine was systematically stripped of its German identity. It was reborn, a hybrid creature of enemy engineering and Soviet will, ready to be unleashed again. It was no longer a panzer. It was a trophy, a prize of war, and its value was beyond rubies. The acquisition of the Panzer IV was only half the battle. A tank, no matter how potent, is merely an inanimate collection of steel, optics, and machinery until it is animated by its crew. For the captured German vehicle, this presented a unique and deeply personal challenge for the Soviet command. Who could be trusted to crew this weapon? It was not a question of mere technical competence, but one of psychology, loyalty, and a specific, almost reckless brand of courage. The men selected would not simply be tankers. They would be pioneers in a dangerous and unorthodox form of warfare, operating behind a mask of enemy steel. The selection process was never formalized in a regulation, but it followed an unwritten, intuitive logic born of the front's harsh realities. The ideal candidate was not a fresh-faced recruit from a training school, but a veteran, a frontovic who had already stared into the abyss of tank warfare and survived. He needed to have a cool head, a pragmatic mind, and a resilience that went beyond mere bravery. The romanticism of war would have been beaten out of him by the hammer blows of combat, replaced by a sober understanding of survival and a burning, focused desire for vengeance. The commander of such a vehicle was the most critical choice. He was often a junior officer or a senior sergeant who had already proven his mettle in commanding a Soviet tank, likely a T-34. His leadership had to be firm yet adaptable, his mind tactical yet innovative. He needed to understand not just how to fight, but how to deceive. He had to be able to think like the enemy, to anticipate German tactics and movements well enough to exploit the panzer's disguise. His authority was absolute within that steel shell, and his decisions would mean the difference between a devastating ambush and a swift, brutal death at the hands of his own comrades. The driver was the second most vital member of this unlikely team. He was more than just an operator. He was a mechanic, a virtuoso of foreign engineering. The command would seek out a driver known for his mechanical empathy, a man with an intuitive feel for machinery and a reputation for keeping his own tank running long after it should have broken down. He had to master the Panzer IV's peculiarities. Its heavier steering, its different gear ratios, the sound of its Maybach engine, and its problematic narrow tracks. His ears had to become attuned to the symphony of German engineering, able to distinguish a benign rumble from a prelude to mechanical failure. He would have spent days with the trophy team's mechanics, learning every bolt and hydraulic line, internalizing the personality of this alien machine. The gunner selected for this duty was a specialist of a different sort. While all Soviet gunners were trained for speed and accuracy, this one needed an additional skill: objectivity. He had to divorce the weapon from its origin. The excellent Zeiss TZF telescopic sight in front of him was not a German tool. It was simply a tool. The long 75mm KWK-40 was not the weapon that had killed his friends. It was now the instrument of his revenge. He had to master its ballistic quirks, its sighting marks, and its loading mechanism with cold, dispassionate efficiency. His role was the culmination of the entire deception: to place a shell precisely where it would cause the most damage, often before the enemy even knew he was there. Completing the crew were the loader and the radio operator. The loader, often the youngest and strongest, faced a physical challenge. The ammunition stowage in the Panzer IV was different, The rounds were heavier or lighter than he was used to, and the rhythm of loading in the confined, differently arranged fighting compartment had to become second nature. The radio operator, if the German set was retained, had to be linguistically adept or at least possess a quick mind for memorizing German radio procedures and call signs to maintain the illusion if needed. More often, he was a specialist in rapid rewiring, tasked with integrating a Soviet radio set to maintain secure communication with his own command. Bringing these 5 men together was not a simple matter of assignment. It was the forging of a new, secret brotherhood. Their first meetings would have been held not in a briefing room, but clustered around or inside the tank itself. There was no manual. Their training was hands-on, relentless, and conducted under a veil of secrecy, often away from the main lines to prevent friendly fire. They learned by doing. The driver practicing starts and stops, the gunner and commander drilling target acquisition, the loader building his speed until the process was seamless. This crew lived in a state of perpetual duality. They were Soviet soldiers, but their daily environment was entirely German. The smell of the fighting compartment, a mix of German oil, cold steel, and sweat, was different. The sounds of the hatches closing, the electric turret motor whirring, the engine's distinct roar, all were alien. They had to learn the new vocabulary of their machine, giving Soviet names to German parts. In a profound psychological shift, this enemy tank had to become theirs. It was no longer a captured weapon. It was their tank. They painted their names on the shells. They developed their own rituals. They learned to trust each other implicitly, for their survival depended not only on their skill but on their ability to function as a single, perfectly coordinated entity inside a wolf's skin. They were a closed circle, bound by a shared, terrifying secret and the unique, heavy responsibility that came with it. The Panzer IV stood before them, an inert mass of cold German steel. It was theirs by right of conquest, a prize won from the battlefield. But possession and mastery are 2 different worlds, separated by a chasm of ignorance, habit, and deeply ingrained mechanical prejudice. For the newly assembled Soviet crew, the days and weeks that followed were a period of intense, clandestine immersion. They were not merely learning to operate a new vehicle. They were undergoing a process of unlearning and relearning, a forced indoctrination into an alien engineering philosophy where every lever, every sound, and every response challenged their instincts. The first and most profound teacher was the machine itself. There were no German instructors, no translated technical manuals. Their education was conducted through a brutal pedagogy of trial and error, guided by the rough translations of a captured German-Russian phrasebook and the innate, hard-won genius of their driver-mechanic, a man like Senior Sergeant Ivanov. He became the crew's oracle, his hands and ears their primary diagnostic tools. The process began not with the roar of the engine, but with silence. The crew would spend hours simply familiarizing themselves with the tank's anatomy, its internal geography a mirror of a different mindset. The driver's position was the first frontier. For a man trained on the T-34, the Panzer IVs controls were a study in complexity. The T-34 used 2 steering levers in a system that was simple, direct, and brutally physical. The Panzer IV, by contrast, featured a steering wheel connected to a sophisticated, fragile regenerative steering system. It was precise, allowing for gentle turns without losing speed, but it was also utterly foreign. Ivanov would first learn the gearbox, memorizing the unique, non-synchromesh pattern that required a precise double-clutching technique. A missed shift would grind the gears with a sickening sound that made the whole crew wince. He learned the feel of the brakes, the response of the throttle, internalizing the tank's weight and balance until he could sense its traction through the seat of his pants. Starting the Maybach HL-120 TRM engine was a ritual. It was not the hearty, rumbling start of the Soviet diesel, but the higher-pitched, whirring growl of a gasoline engine, turning over with the help of a bulky inertia starter. The crew learned it sounds like a doctor learning a heartbeat. A high-pitched whine might indicate a faulty bearing. A misfire could point to a clogged fuel filter or the wrong octane fuel, a constant logistical headache. They learned the engine's temperature tolerances, its thirst for coolant, and its peculiar aversion to the Russian cold, which could seize its intricate parts more readily than the simpler T-34 diesel. For the gunner, Corporal Petrov, the transition was one from brute force to finesse. The T-34's turret traverse was often a laborious, manual process, requiring the gunner to crank a handle with all his might. The Panzer IV's powered hydraulic traverse, operated by a simple foot pedal and a hand wheel, felt like magic. It was smooth, responsive, and quiet. His new world was framed by the Zeiss TZF-5F sight. Compared to the simpler, narrower field of view in his own tank, this was like looking through a window. The clarity and magnification were stunning, allowing him to identify details on targets at distances that were previously abstract. But this power came with a burden of precision. He had to learn the new gun's ballistics, the flat trajectory of the long 75mm KWK-40, the way the shell would drop over distance, and how to adjust the sophisticated range scale. He practiced loading the longer, heavier German shells, finding the rhythm in the more cramped fighting compartment, learning where every round was stowed. The commander, Lieutenant Sokolov, faced the tactical challenge. His role was to fuse the machine's capabilities with a new way of fighting. He learned to use the excellent German radio, the Fug-5, its range and clarity a revelation. He studied visibility from the cupola, understanding the dead zones and sight lines. Most importantly, he drilled his crew relentlessly. They practiced emergency procedures, what to do if the hydraulic traverse failed, forcing a switch to the manual backup, how to escape through the different hatch layouts, how to perform a blind retreat using only the driver's vision slits. They practiced until the alien controls became extensions of their own bodies, until the German language markings on the fire extinguishers and switches were understood instinctively. This period of mastery was a psychological crucible. The initial awe and resentment toward the machine gradually faded, replaced by a grudging respect for its qualities and a clear-eyed understanding of its flaws. They learned to hate its narrow tracks in the deep mud, but appreciate its stability as a firing platform. They cursed the complexity of its engine but praised the accuracy of its gun. Slowly, imperceptibly, the German tank ceased to be German. It became simply their tank. It was the Sokolov Wolf or the Avenger, its German cross painted over with a bold white Soviet star. The machine had been captured, and now, through sheer force of will and adaptability, it had been truly conquered. The crew had not just learned to operate it. They had tamed it, bending its Teutonic precision to their own rugged, relentless purpose. They were no longer just a Soviet tank crew. They were the masters of a hybrid weapon, ready to write their own chapter in the brutal, pragmatic history of the Eastern Front. The true power of the captured Panzer IV was not merely that it was another tank added to the Red Army's order of battle. Its value was far more subtle and profound, transforming it from a simple weapon into a multifaceted strategic tool. In the hands of its Soviet crew, it became a weapon of psychological warfare, a tool of tactical deception, and a mobile intelligence-gathering platform. It was, in essence, the Red Army's most secret and unorthodox weapon, a phantom that operated in the gray area between the clearly drawn lines of two opposing armies. The most immediate and devastating application was the Trojan horse tactic. This was the core of the Iron Cuckoo concept. A lone Panzer IV or a small group of them would be sent ahead of the main Soviet forces. Bearing the unmistakable silhouettes and markings of the Wehrmacht, they would approach German positions. From a distance, through German binoculars, they were a welcome sight, a returning reconnaissance patrol, a flank security element, or reinforcements moving up to the line. This granted them a precious and deadly commodity, time. They could approach to point-blank range, their true identity masked by the universal symbol of their own armor. German infantry might wave them forward. Sentries would hold their fire. They could move through rear areas, identifying command posts, artillery batteries, and supply dumps with impunity. The moment of revelation was catastrophic for the enemy. The turret would swing with deliberate, menacing purpose, no longer friendly. The long 75mm gun, a symbol of German technological prowess, would fire a high-explosive shell directly into a command bunker. Machine guns would rake trenches filled with soldiers who had, moments before, felt a sense of relief at their arrival. The shock was not just physical but psychological. It sowed a deep and pervasive paranoia, eroding the fundamental trust a soldier must have in identifying his own side. An order as simple as "German tanks are approaching" became fraught with ambiguity. Which German tanks? Who did they truly serve? This deception extended to armored engagements. On the vast, smoky battlefield of the Eastern Front, identification was often made by silhouette at extreme range. A Soviet commander spotting a Panzer IV would naturally classify it as a target. But when that Panzer IV was operating in concert with a squadron of T-34s, it created a moment of crippling hesitation for the enemy. German tank commanders, seeing the familiar shape, would pause, questioning their identification. Was it a captured vehicle? Was it a German unit mistakenly engaging them? In the split-second calculus of a tank duel, that hesitation was fatal. The captured Panzer IV could use its excellent optics to range targets and fire with devastating accuracy, while the enemy was still processing the impossible image before them. Beyond its role as a deceiver, the captured Panzer was an invaluable intelligence asset. It was a fully functional, front-line specimen of German technology. While intelligence officers in the rear would dissect reports and occasionally examine wreckages, Sokolov's crew operated a living laboratory. They reported on the tank's performance in real combat conditions, how its armor stood up to Soviet anti-tank rifles, the effective range of its gun against various targets, its mechanical reliability during prolonged operations. The driver mechanics' observations on the Maybach engine's fuel consumption and failure points were worth their weight in gold to Soviet engineers looking for design weaknesses to exploit. Furthermore, the tank's own equipment became a source of intelligence. The German radio, if retained, could be used to monitor enemy traffic. They could learn German call signs, unit designations, and even glean snippets of operational intent. The optics themselves were a prize. Understanding the quality of German sights helped Soviet tacticians develop better methods of concealment and approach. The secret weapon was, therefore, a weapon of the mind as much as of metal. Its existence was a closely guarded secret within the Soviet regiment. Radio procedures for these units were often unique and cryptic to prevent the Germans from discovering the ruse. The crews were isolated, their exploits known only to a handful of high-ranking officers. They operated in a shadow war, their successes measured not just in destroyed targets, but in the erosion of enemy morale and the sowing of chaotic distrust behind German lines. They were the ultimate pragmatists in a war of annihilation. They turned the German creed of qualitative superiority against itself. The meticulous engineering, the excellent optics, the distinctive silhouette, all the elements that made the Panzer for an effective weapon for the Wehrmacht were now the very things that made it a uniquely dangerous and secret weapon for the Red Army. It was a phantom in the enemy's ranks, a wolf who had learned to walk on its hind legs and wear the shepherd's clothes, waiting for the perfect moment to bare its fangs. The triumphant capture of a Panzer IV and its subsequent mastery by a skilled Soviet crew was merely the opening act of a far more complex and relentless drama. Beyond the daring tactics and psychological warfare lay the prosaic, grinding reality of logistics, a theater of war where the brilliant deception of the iron cuckoo could be grounded by something as simple as a missing fuel filter or a broken track pin. Maintaining a German war machine deep inside the Soviet war apparatus was a logistical nightmare, a constant battle against incompatibility, scarcity, and the relentless wear of combat. The first and most immediate challenge was sustenance for the steel beast. The Panzer IVs Maybach HL-120 TRM engine thirsted for high-octane aviation gasoline, a fuel entirely different from the diesel that powered the T-34 and the vast majority of the Red Army's mechanized fleet. The Soviet logistics chain, a masterpiece of standardization and mass production, was not designed to accommodate this exotic requirement. A requisition for 75mm ammunition was straightforward. A requisition for German Panzer for fuel was a bureaucratic anomaly that could see a clerk scratching his head in disbelief. The crew, therefore, became masters of improvisation. They learned which captured German fuel dumps to target during offensives, hoarding jerrycans of the precious liquid like gold. They developed relationships, sometimes through barter with their own supplies, with rear echelon truck units that used similar gasoline, creating a clandestine, unofficial supply network. The absence of the correct fuel could mean blending available grades, a risky practice that led to engine knocking, reduced power, and increased wear on the complex engine. Ammunition was a similarly critical bottleneck. The long 75mm KWK-40 gun fired a cartridge unique to later model Panzer IVs and the tank destroyer variants of the Marder and Stu G3. Every shell fired was one less in a finite, irreplaceable stockpile. While Soviet factories produced thousands of 76.2mm rounds for the T-34, there was no production line for German 75mm PZGR 39 armor-piercing shells. The crew's survival depended on a brutal arithmetic of salvage and conservation. They became scavengers on the battlefield, meticulously combing through destroyed German panzers and abandoned supply vehicles for their specific ammunition. A successful engagement was measured not only in enemies destroyed but in captured shells secured. This constant scarcity forced a discipline of marksmanship unheard of in standard Soviet units. Every shot had to count. Spraying suppressing fire was an unaffordable luxury. The gunner, Petrov, had to be sure of his first shot, for a second might not be available. The maintenance cycle was a daily struggle against entropy. The Panzer IV was a machine of precise tolerances and specialized parts. Its steering system, its complex transmission, its delicate optics, all required specific tools and components that simply did not exist in the standard Soviet toolkit. The driver mechanic, Ivanov, was not just a driver. He was a magician of improvisation. A broken German track link, with its specific pin and connector, could not be replaced by a heavier Soviet one. The solution was cannibalization. A parts tank, another, less fortunate captured Panzer IV that was too damaged to fight but still held valuable organs, would be kept in a hidden rear area, a mechanical cadaver to be harvested. Ivanov and his crew learned to manufacture simple parts themselves, using a mobile field forge and lathe, painstakingly replicating a German bolt or a bushing. They maintained a meticulous inventory of their remaining German-specific parts. How many spare road wheels, how many torsion bars, how many lenses for the gun sight. This inventory was as crucial to their survival as their stock of ammunition. This logistical isolation forged a unique, almost symbiotic relationship between the crew and their machine. They were its sole caretakers in a world that could not support it. They knew its every groan and rattle, not just as operators, but as its life support system. A standard T-34 crew could expect a broken part to be replaced from a regimental depot. Sokolov's crew knew that if they did not have the part, or could not fabricate it, the tank would become a permanent static pillbox. This constant logistical anxiety also shaped their tactical employment. A regiment commander could not use his captured Panzer as recklessly as a standard tank. It was a precision instrument, a scalpel to be used for specific high-value missions where its deceptive qualities were paramount. It could not be thrown into the meat grinder of a frontal assault where it might be immobilized and lost. Every foray behind enemy lines was calculated against the risk of a mechanical breakdown that would strand the precious asset in territory where it could not be recovered. The Iron Cuckoo was a formidable weapon, but it was a weapon on a tether, its range and endurance dictated not by command, but by the dwindling stock of German gasoline, ammunition, and spare parts hidden in its belly and in the crew's secret cache. Their war was fought not only against the Wehrmacht, but against the relentless, invisible clock of logistical attrition. The phrase "the road to Berlin" evokes images of the great, triumphant offensives of 1944 and 1945, the Bagration operation shattering Army Group Center, the Vistula offensive, the final, brutal street fighting in the heart of the Reich. But for the crew of the captured Panzer IV, their road was a different one. It was not a single grand highway of advance, but a fractured, looping, and often contradictory path across the blood-soaked canvas of the Eastern Front. Their journey was a microcosm of the war's chaotic ebb and flow, a testament to the fact that even as the strategic initiative irrevocably shifted to the Red Army, the tactical reality for those at the sharp end remained a brutal, unpredictable affair. Their war was not one of continuous frontline combat. It was a cycle of intense, clandestine operation followed by periods of anxious waiting and frantic repair. After a successful mission, perhaps a deep raid that destroyed a German artillery battery or sowed confusion in a rear area, the Iron Cuckoo would be withdrawn. It was too valuable, and its deception too fragile, to be risked in the day-to-day grinding of positional warfare. They would fall back to a designated secure area, often a secluded forest or a destroyed village far from the main troop concentrations, where their unique logistical needs could be managed away from prying eyes. Here, the crew transformed from warriors into engineers and scavengers. The driver-mechanic, Ivanov, would lead the painstaking process of maintenance. The engine was serviced with the last of their captured German oil filters. The tracks, perpetually strained by the vehicle's weight and the Russian terrain, were inspected link by link. The complex steering system was checked for wear. This was when the parts tank, their cannibalized twin, was ruthlessly stripped for anything serviceable. A broken road wheel was swapped out. A damaged vision block was replaced. These periods of respite were tense, haunted by the knowledge that their ability to fight was dwindling with every replaced part for which there was no replacement. Then new orders would arrive. The strategic situation was evolving with breathtaking speed. After the climactic battle at Kursk in the summer of 1943, which their crew likely observed from the sidelines, too unique to be spent in that colossal armored melee, the Red Army began its great westward push. The Soviet war machine was learning, becoming more sophisticated, more mobile, and more powerful. The crew of the Panzer IV found their role evolving with it. In the large-scale offensive operations that followed, their specialty was the breakthrough. They would be attached to a forward detachment or an advanced guard, a mixed force of tanks, motorized infantry, and engineers tasked with exploiting a rupture in the German lines. Their job was to push deep into the enemy's rear, using their disguise to bypass strong points and spread panic. They became experts in the march by deception. A column of T-34s might be spotted and engaged, but a lone panzer for moving confidently down a road could often pass unchallenged long enough to secure a vital bridge or disrupt a line of communication. Their journey took them through the haunting landscapes of a retreating war. They rolled through the scorched earth of the German scorched earth policy, through villages where the only signs of life were the hollow-eyed civilians emerging from cellars. They saw the grotesque evidence of German occupation, the mass graves, the destroyed synagogues, the slave labor camps liberated by the advancing army. This hardened their resolve, transforming their tactical mission into a personal crusade. They were no longer just soldiers following orders. They were avengers. The geography of their war was written in the names of liberated cities. Having likely begun their journey in the aftermath of Stalingrad, in the vast steppes of Ukraine, they pushed west. They saw the ruins of Kharkov, the crossing of the Dnieper, the battles for the right bank Ukraine. Each river crossing was a monumental challenge, each defended town a potential death trap. Their German tank, once a tool for deep raids, increasingly became a psychological weapon at the spearhead of the advance. The sight of a Panzer IV, emblazoned with Soviet stars and patriotic slogans, leading a column of T-34s into a shattered city, was a powerful symbol of the overturned order. It was the ultimate humiliation for the defending Germans and a potent symbol of Soviet ingenuity and strength for the liberating forces. This was their road to Berlin, a 1,000-mile journey of nerve, ingenuity, and constant adaptation. It was not a straight line. It was a path marked by hidden supply caches, frantic repairs under the stars, moments of terrifying vulnerability when their disguise nearly failed, and the grim satisfaction of striking a blow against the retreating enemy with his own weapon. They were carried forward on the tide of the Red Army's advancing million-man fronts, but they swam in that tide with their own unique stroke, a phantom in plain sight, inching ever closer to the lair of the beast they had been trained to impersonate. To cross into the space the maps designated as behind German lines was, for any soldier, an act of supreme courage. It meant leaving behind the relative security of one's own formations, the known artillery ranges, and the comforting presence of comrades. For the crew of the captured Panzer IV, this transition was a descent into a state of heightened, surreal paradox. They were not infiltrating the enemy's rear. They were, in the most literal and terrifying sense, driving into it. Their greatest protection was their greatest threat, and their mission was to navigate a landscape where every sight and sound was designed to welcome them, even as they prepared to deliver death. The moment of crossing was always the most critical. It required a gap in the lines, a seam torn open by a preceding Soviet assault. They would move not with a roaring charge, but with a deliberate, confident pace that mimicked a German unit conducting a tactical withdrawal or shifting to plug a hole. As they passed through the shattered forward positions, the world transformed. The crump of incoming Soviet artillery faded, replaced by the different, more organized sounds of the German rear, the rumble of Opel Blitz trucks on better-maintained roads, the shouted orders in a guttural language, the sight of clean, efficient field kitchens and neatly arranged command tents. Inside the Panzer, the atmosphere was electric with tension, a silence broken only by the intercom's hushed reports. Lieutenant Sokolov, standing in the commander's cupola, was the orchestra conductor of this deception. He had to project an aura of unquestioned authority. He would don a captured German officer's field cap, its distinctive shape visible from a distance. His posture, erect, observant, scanning the horizon with German binoculars, was a performance. A casual wave to a German sentry, a dismissive gesture to a squad of infantry, these were not just acts, they were vital tactical maneuvers. Any sign of hesitation, any furtive glance, could betray them. The driver, Ivanov, fought his own battle at the controls. He had to resist the ingrained Soviet instinct to take cover at the sound of an aircraft or to drive in the erratic, shell-avoiding patterns of the front. Here, he had to drive like a German, purposefully, directly, using the roads whenever possible. He had to master the subtle body language of the machine itself, avoiding the sudden, jerky movements of a novice and instead emulating the smooth, confident handling of an experienced panzer driver. The sound of their own engine, the distinct Maybach growl, was now their passport, a sound that signaled friend to every German ear. For the rest of the crew, the experience was one of claustrophobic observation. Through the vision slits and periscopes, they witnessed the underbelly of the Wehrmacht war machine in a state of unguarded routine. They saw artillerymen resting beside their howitzers, the guns silent now that the front had moved past them. They passed columns of exhausted infantry marching towards the sound of the guns, their faces often turning towards the friendly panzer with looks of grim hope. They saw supply depots with stacks of wooden crates, fuel dumps lined with precious jerrycans, and signals trucks with their long antennas, all targets of supreme value, all being calmly pointed out over the intercom and mentally logged by Sokolov. The psychological toll was immense. They were surrounded by the enemy, close enough to see their faces, to smell their tobacco. The gunner, Petrov, would have the crosshairs of his superb Zeissight centered on a group of German officers studying a map, his finger resting near the trigger, yet he was forbidden from firing. The loader would sit next to a rack of high-explosive shells, any one of which could turn the idyllic scene outside into a hellscape, but he had to wait. They were ghosts at the feast, forced to witness the intimate, mundane details of the very army they were dedicated to destroying. It required a discipline of steel to remain passive, to absorb intelligence, and to wait for the primary target, the one worth blowing their cover. When the moment to strike finally came, the transition from ghost to avenger was cataclysmic. Sokolov would give a quiet, predetermined order. The turret would begin its smooth, hydraulic traverse, no longer scanning, but locking on. The sudden, unexpected movement of the turret was often the first and only warning the Germans had. By the time a sentry shouted, it was too late. The first 75mm shell would already be screaming towards the command post or the ammunition dump. The shock was absolute. The explosion would be followed by a moment of stunned confusion, as the German soldiers' minds tried to reconcile the friendly silhouette with the hostile act. By the time they understood, the Panzer's machine guns would be hosing down the area, and Ivanov would already be throwing the tank into reverse or spinning it on its axis for a rapid retreat. The journey back was a mad dash, a race against the now-awakened hornet's nest. The disguise was blown. The confident pace was replaced by a desperate, high-speed flight, weaving through the chaos they had created, hoping to reach the safety of the Soviet lines before German anti-tank guns could be brought to bear. They had been behind the lines, not as saboteurs in the dark, but as a perfectly camouflaged predator, walking in plain sight before delivering a blow that was as psychologically shattering as it was physically destructive. The shell from the captured Panzer IVs KWK-40 gun did more than just annihilate a command post or ignite a fuel depot. Its most devastating shrapnel was psychological, shredding the very fabric of trust and certainty within the Wehrmacht's ranks. While the T-34 was a hammer, a blunt and terrifying instrument of massed force, the iron cuckoo was a poisoned needle, precisely targeting the enemy's mind. Its existence, and the rumors of its deeds, cultivated a pervasive paranoia that was far more corrosive than the loss of any single piece of equipment or stretch of territory. The initial German reaction to an attack from a friendly tank was one of cognitive dissonance. The human brain, especially under the stress of combat, relies on pattern recognition for survival. The silhouette of a Panzer IV was a pattern signaling safety, or, at the very least, known quantity. To see that pattern suddenly vomit fire and death created a momentary mental short-circuit. Was it a terrible mistake? A case of friendly fire from a disoriented crew? This fleeting hesitation was a weapon in itself, gifting the Soviet crew those precious extra seconds to fire, maneuver, and escape. But the impact lingered long after the tank had disappeared. In the aftermath of such an attack, the German command structure would be flooded with confused, contradictory reports. A junior officer would swear he saw a Panzer IV open fire. Others might claim it was a Soviet ruse using a different vehicle, or perhaps a new type of Soviet tank that resembled their own. The very language used to describe the enemy became unstable. The simple, crucial report, "Enemy tanks advancing," was no longer sufficient. It now required a frantic, qualifying addendum, "They look like ours." This sowed chaos in the German response. Commanders hesitated to authorize artillery strikes or commit anti-tank reserves for fear of blasting their own retreating units. Precious minutes were lost in verification, minutes during which a Soviet breakthrough could be exploited. This confusion bred a deep-seated and institutionalized suspicion. A sentry on the perimeter, seeing a Panzer IV approaching in the twilight, could no longer simply wave it through. He had to challenge it, to demand identification, to scrutinize the crew's faces in the hatches. But what was the correct challenge? The passwords changed daily, but the silhouette of a Panzer IV did not. A clever Soviet commander like Sokolov might use captured German signal flares, or even a few barked phrases learned from a phrasebook to deepen the uncertainty. This erosion of trust extended horizontally across the German forces. A unit moving up to the front would now be viewed with latent suspicion by the troops they were meant to relieve. The simple, unifying symbol of their own armor had been corrupted, turned into a mask for the enemy. The legend of the Russian panzers grew with each engagement, amplified by the grim gossip that traveled through the trenches and rear areas. It was a folktale of the Eastern Front, a ghost story told by soldiers who had seen something impossible. This myth-making was a force multiplier for the Soviets far beyond the capabilities of a single tank. The psychological burden shifted from the Soviet crew, who grew in confidence with each successful deception, to the average German soldier, who now had to fight an enemy that could be anywhere, even inside the familiar skin of his own technology. It created a climate of fear where the rear area, a place for rest and resupply, was no longer a sanctuary. The front line was no longer a defined boundary. It was everywhere the Phantom Panzer might be. For the Soviet crew, the psychological warfare was a double-edged sword. Their success bred a powerful, almost arrogant confidence. They were outwitting the vaunted German military not with superior numbers, but with superior cunning. They saw the confusion in the eyes of the Germans they passed, the hesitation in their movements. This was a potent morale booster, a feeling of intellectual and tactical supremacy. They were not just killing the enemy. They were humiliating him, demonstrating that his prized machines and his military procedures could be turned into a weapon against him. However, this existence also carried a unique and grinding psychological weight. They lived in a state of perpetual performance, where a single mistake in their act, a misplaced wave, a poorly executed response to a challenge, a mechanical sound that drew a mechanic's curious ear, meant a swift and brutal death. The constant, high-stakes deception was mentally exhausting. They had to be more German than the Germans to survive, inhabiting a hated identity so completely that it could feel disorienting. The cheers of their own comrades upon their return were a temporary relief from this pressure, a reminder of their true allegiance in a war where the lines between friend, foe, and facade had become terrifyingly blurred. The Iron Cuckoo was not just a tank. It was a state of mind, and its most lasting damage was etched not into the landscape, but into the psyche of the enemy. The photograph is the anchor of our story, and its inscription is the source of its profound dissonance. Berlin, March 1943. For the historian, this is not a simple caption. It is a riddle wrapped in a paradox. It places our Soviet-crewed Panzer IV in the lion's den a full 2 years before the Red Army would actually fight its way into the city's suburbs. This chronological and geographical impossibility forces a confrontation between the evidence of the image and the unyielding facts of the campaign map. To resolve this enigma is to understand the chaotic, often opaque nature of record-keeping in total war and the many layers of meaning embedded in a simple piece of data. On the grand strategic level, March 1943 was a period of precarious equilibrium and furious preparation on the Eastern Front. The tide had turned at Stalingrad, with the final surrender of the German Sixth Army in early February. The Northern Front at Leningrad was also seeing Soviet gains with the successful Operation Iskra. Yet, this was not a period of unstoppable Soviet advance. In the south, the front was fluid and volatile. The German forces, reeling from Stalingrad, managed to stabilize the line and, in mid-March, even recaptured the city of Kharkov in a stunning counterstroke led by Manstein. The notion of a Soviet tank crew in any tank being in Berlin at this precise moment is a historical absurdity. The front line was hundreds of kilometers to the east, running through the shattered cities of Ukraine. Berlin was a distant, heavily defended capital, its skies still safe from enemy bombers, its reality utterly disconnected from the daily struggle of a frontline tank crew. Therefore, we must divorce the inscription from its literal interpretation and view it as an artifact in its own right, a piece of data that was created not by the event itself, but by the bureaucratic machinery that processed the event. The most plausible explanation lies in the caption's origin. It was likely written on the back of the photograph by a clerk, a censor, or a staff officer in a rear echelon, perhaps days or even weeks after the film was developed. The chaos of the front in early 1943 was immense. Units were constantly moving, merging, and being reconstituted after the colossal battles of the winter. Meticulous record-keeping was a luxury often sacrificed for operational urgency. The location, Berlin, is the first clue. It almost certainly does not refer to the German capital. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, German Mennonite settlers had established numerous colonies across the Russian Empire, particularly in Ukraine. They often named their settlements after their homeland: Berlin, Leipzig, Stuttgart. These were small, agricultural communities, but they existed on military maps. A Soviet soldier or officer writing a hasty location for a photograph would naturally use the official name of the place. For him, he was in Berlin. This simple, mundane fact resolves the geographical impossibility, placing the Panzer IV not in the heart of the Reich, but on the vast, war-torn steppe of Ukraine, where the real fighting was occurring in March 1943. The date, March 1943, is similarly fluid. It could represent the date the film was developed and catalogued, not the date it was exposed. A film canister might sit in a courier's bag for weeks before reaching a mobile developing lab in the rear. The photograph of the crew lounging on their Panzer could have been taken in late February, during the final, chaotic stages of the post-Stalingrad offensives, or during the fierce fighting around Kharkov. By the time the clerk in the relative safety of an Army-level headquarters stamped March 1943 on it, the tactical situation had already changed dramatically. This resolution does not diminish the photograph's power. It transforms it. The Enigma of Berlin, March 1943, ceases to be a historical error and becomes a key to a deeper truth. It reveals the fog of war that extended even to administrative functions. It highlights the vast cultural and geographical landscape of the war, where a Soviet tank could be photographed in a Ukrainian Berlin, while the world's attention was fixed on the battle for the Ukrainian Kharkov. The inscription is a palimpsest, a surface meaning obscuring a richer, more complex reality. By solving the riddle of the caption, we free the image to tell its true story, not of a fantastical, premature raid on the Nazi capital, but of the gritty, pragmatic, and widespread reality of Soviet troops using captured German hardware at the very moment the war's momentum was definitively, irrevocably beginning to shift. The photograph is not an anomaly. It is a testament, and its mislabeled context is a perfect metaphor for the chaotic, misunderstood, and brutally pragmatic nature of the war on the Eastern Front. The tactical deception of the captured Panzer IV was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, but it was a gambit that existed on a razor's edge. Its success was entirely dependent on the enemy's willingness to be deceived, on their assumption that the familiar silhouette before them was what it appeared to be. This fragile illusion, however, faced its ultimate test not from heightened German suspicion, but from the arrival of a new, far more terrifying predator on the battlefield: the German heavy tank, the Tiger I. The presence of the Tiger transformed the iron Cuckoos role, forcing it to evolve from a lone wolf into a cunning fox, using its disguise not for attack, but for survival and the enablement of a more powerful hunter. The Tiger I, introduced in late 1942 and encountered in significant numbers through 1943, was a quantum leap in armored warfare. Its thick, virtually impervious frontal armor and its devastating 88mm gun could obliterate any Soviet tank at ranges where the T-34's own gun was useless. The standard Soviet tactic against the Tiger involved ambushes at close range or overwhelming numerical superiority, both incredibly costly strategies. A lone T-34 spotting a Tiger at 1,500 meters was already a dead tank. It simply didn't know it yet. For the crew of the captured Panzer IV, the Tiger represented both an existential threat and a new, macabre opportunity. Their disguise, which had once been a sword for striking the enemy's rear, now became a shield. The Tiger's greatest weakness, aside from its mechanical complexity, was its slow turret traverse and limited ammunition count. A Tiger commander, seeing a Panzer IV on his flank, would likely identify it as a friendly unit providing support. He would not immediately swing his massive gun towards it. This granted the Soviet crew a window of opportunity, not to engage, for their own 75mm gun was utterly useless against the Tiger's frontal armor, but to become the eyes and the bait for the entire Soviet sector. Their new mission was one of high-stakes reconnaissance and target designation. A unit facing a Tiger would call upon Sokolov's crew. Their Panzer IV would then advance, not with aggressive intent, but with the deliberate, confident posture of a German tank moving to a support position. They would get as close to the Tiger as they dared, using their disguise to avoid being fired upon. From this privileged vantage point, they would radio vital, real-time intelligence back to Soviet command. The Tiger's exact location, its direction of travel, the composition of its supporting infantry, and most importantly, its vulnerabilities. They would report on the flank of the beast, where its armor was thinner. This was where the deception became a deadly lure. Having identified the Tiger, the Iron Cuckoo could then play the role of a wounded bird. It might feign a mechanical breakdown or fire its machine gun in a direction that suggested engagement with a hidden enemy, all to hold the Tiger's attention and fix it in place. The goal was to make the Tiger commander believe he was in a secure position, providing support to a friendly unit. Meanwhile, the real hunters were moving into position. The intelligence provided by Sokolov's crew would allow pre-registered Soviet artillery to rain down on the Tiger's position, not to destroy it, but to blind its optics and panic its supporting infantry. More critically, it allowed heavy Soviet anti-tank assets, such as the Su-152's Zveroboy, Animal Hunter, or camouflaged ZIS-3 divisional guns, to maneuver into a flanking position. The Panzer IV, in its German skin, was the perfect spotter. Could guide the real killers into the fight without raising the Tiger's alarm. The moment of truth was cataclysmic. From the Tiger's perspective, the world would be calm, with a friendly Panzer IV nearby, until a storm of high-explosive shells from an unseen artillery battery began to fall, or until a massive 152mm shell from a hidden Su-152 slammed into its side, blowing the 50-ton behemoth apart. The Tiger crew would die bewildered, likely never understanding how the trap had been sprung so perfectly. This role required nerves of tungsten. It meant sitting a few hundred meters from one of the most powerful tanks ever built, knowing that their disguise was the only thing stopping it from turning them into molten scrap. The gunner, Petrov, would have the Tiger in his sights, his finger on the trigger, fighting the instinct to fire a futile shot. The driver, Ivanov, had to be prepared to execute a frantic, evasive retreat the moment the Tiger's turret began to suspiciously swing in their direction. They were no longer the assassins. They were the spotters for the executioner. They were the wolf who had learned to walk among the Tigers, not to fight them, but to lead them to the hunter's pit. In the escalating arms race of the Eastern Front, the value of the Iron Cuckoo had transformed. It was no longer just a weapon of deception. It was a vital component in the Soviet system of neutralizing the Wehrmacht's most feared weapon, proving that sometimes the most effective soldier is not the one who fires the killing shot, but the one who tells him exactly where to aim. In war, stories rarely have clean endings. For the crew of the captured Panzer IV, a tale born from such improbable circumstances, the final chapter was always destined to be written in ambiguity, lost to the relentless churn of the front. There is no archive, no definitive after-action report that details the ultimate fate of Lieutenant Sokolov, Senior Sergeant Ivanov, Corporal Petrov, and their machine. Their story, like that of millions of others, dissolves into the fog of war, leaving only probabilities and the silent testimony of the photograph that started it all. Yet, by understanding the nature of their service, we can trace the most likely paths their end may have taken. The most probable and most honorable end was destruction in combat. The Iron Cuckoo's existence was a calculated risk, and the odds were bound to catch up with it. The deception was not infallible. A more vigilant German officer, a veteran who noticed a slight error in the tank's markings or the unfamiliar cut of a uniform glimpsed in a hatch, could have been their undoing. A single flare shot into the sky, a prearranged challenge they could not answer, and the illusion would shatter. In an instant, their greatest asset would become a death trap, making them the primary target for every anti-tank gun, Panzerfaust, and tank in the vicinity. Their end would have been swift and brutal, a concentrated storm of fire focused on the traitorous machine. They would have died in a final, vicious firefight, their identities and their tank's unique history obliterated in a shared pyre of German steel and Soviet blood. Alternatively, their demise could have been a result of the very anonymity they exploited. In the chaotic, large-scale armored battles of 1944, The distinction between a captured Panzer and a real one would have been irrelevant to a distant T-34 crew or a pilot in an IL-2 Sturmovik. A case of mistaken identity, a tragic friendly fire incident, was a constant, grim possibility. A Soviet anti-tank gunner, seeing the silhouette of a Panzer IV emerging from the smoke, would not have hesitated. He would have fired. The crew would have perished at the hands of their own comrades, a cruel irony and a testament to the perfection of their own disguise. Their own command would have listed them as missing in action, their true story dying with them. There is, too, the possibility of a mechanical death. The Panzer IV was a complex machine living on borrowed time and cannibalized parts. A final, catastrophic mechanical failure, a seized engine in the middle of a retreat, a broken final drive during a river crossing, could have left them stranded. Faced with an advancing enemy or the impossibility of recovery, the crew would have been forced to scuttle their own tank. They would have placed a grenade in the fighting compartment, destroying the radio and the firing mechanism, and melted back into the ranks of the Red Army as regular infantry, their extraordinary chapter closed. The machine that had been their home, their weapon, and their identity would be left as a silent, scorched wreck by the roadside, its story unknown to the Germans who passed it and the Soviets who followed. And then there is the faint, hopeful chance of survival. Perhaps they fought on through the summer of 1944, through Operation Bagration and the Great Sweep into Poland. Perhaps, as the Red Army standardized its equipment and the tactical need for their specific deception waned, the command finally decided the risk outweighed the reward. The invaluable, battle-hardened crew might have been reassigned, given a brand new T-34-85, and ordered to continue the fight as a standard, if highly experienced, tank unit. Their unique Panzer IV, having served its purpose, might have been quietly retired to a rear area for technical evaluation or simply abandoned when a critical part finally gave out. Sokolov, Ivanov, Petrov, and the others could have seen the end of the war, their incredible secret buried deep, a wild tale for their grandchildren that would strain belief. We will never know for certain. The photograph freezes them in a moment of confident repose, masters of their improbable domain. It does not show the end. This ambiguity is, in its own way, fitting. Their story is a microcosm of the Eastern Front itself, fragmented, undocumented, and ultimately swallowed by the scale of the conflict. They were ghosts in the machine, and like all ghosts, they vanished when their work was done. Whether they fell in a blaze of glory, succumbed to a tragic error, or walked away to live in a world they helped save, their legacy is secure. They embodied the brutal pragmatism and unwavering resilience that defined the Red Army's long, bloody road to victory. The Iron Cuckoo and its crew were a fleeting, brilliant anomaly, a secret weapon whose greatest success was that it existed at all, a testament to the fact that in the face of annihilation, the human spirit will find a way to turn even the enemy's strength into a weapon for survival. The story of the Soviet crewed Panzer IV is far more than a curious anecdote from the Eastern Front. It is a legacy, a multifaceted testament to the brutal realities of a war unlike any other. The Iron Cuckoos and their ilk left behind a legacy that echoes through military doctrine, historical memory, and our fundamental understanding of the conflict, transcending the fate of any single crew or machine. Their most immediate legacy was a practical one, written in the evolving field of Soviet military intelligence and combat engineering. The hands-on experience gained from operating, maintaining, and fighting in the Panzer IV provided the Red Army with an unparalleled, real-time autopsy of German technology. The reports filed by crews like Sokolov's on the Panzer IV's optical superiority, the vulnerabilities of its side armor, the specific weaknesses of its Maybach engine and final drive, and the tactical patterns of its use were invaluable. This was not theoretical data from a test range. It was combat-tested intelligence, gathered from behind the wheel of the enemy's own vehicle. This knowledge directly influenced Soviet tank design and anti-tank tactics. Understanding the precise capabilities of the German optics pushed Soviet designers to improve their own. Identifying the mechanical frailties of German tanks allowed Soviet commanders to plan for battlefield attrition, knowing that a certain percentage of the enemy's strength would simply break down. The Iron Cuckoos were the ultimate reconnaissance patrol, providing a deep-dive analysis of the enemy's tools that no other method could replicate. Beyond the technical, their legacy is one of psychological warfare precedent. The systematic use of captured armor by the Red Army demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the enemy's mindset long before such concepts were formally codified. They proved that a weapon's psychological impact could be as potent as its kinetic force. The paranoia they sowed, the erosion of trust within the German ranks, and the demoralizing effect of being attacked by one's own symbol of strength became a case study in tactical deception. While never adopted on a mass scale, the success of these units proved the immense value of what would later be termed asymmetric warfare, using the enemy's expectations and assets against him. They were pioneers in a shadow war where perception was a weapon, and their exploits informed future Soviet and Russian military thinking on maskirovka, masking/deception. On a human level, the legacy of the Iron Cuckoos is a powerful narrative that challenges the monolithic, often simplistic portrayals of the Eastern Front. The standard historical image is one of two colossal, impersonal forces clashing in a straightforward contest of material and will. The story of a single Soviet crew in a German tank reintroduces the human elements of ingenuity, adaptability, and individual agency. It forces us to look beyond the grand strategic maps and into the gritty, pragmatic decisions made by soldiers fighting for survival. These men were not faceless cogs in a machine. They were problem solvers of the highest order, mastering a complex and hated instrument to secure their own survival and advance their cause. Their story is one of ultimate pragmatism triumphing over ideological purity, a theme that resonates deeply in the context of a life-or-death struggle. Furthermore, their legacy serves as a perfect metaphor for the entire Soviet war effort. The Panzer IV was a product of German engineering precision, quality, and complexity. The Soviet T-34 was a product of ruggedness, simplicity, and mass production. In capturing and operating the Panzer IV, the Red Army did not simply use a tool. It absorbed and subverted the enemy's philosophy. It took German quality and bent it to the Soviet will of quantity and relentless pressure. The Iron Cuckoo was a hybrid, a symbol of the Soviet Union's ability to absorb the worst the Reich could throw at it, learn from it, and then use those very lessons to bludgeon the enemy into submission. It was the ultimate act of tactical and symbolic appropriation. Today, the photograph that sparked this narrative remains their most enduring legacy. It is a historical puzzle that, when solved, unlocks a richer, more complex understanding of the war. It speaks of a hidden war within the war, a conflict of wits and nerve fought in the shadows of the larger confrontation. The legacy of the Iron Cuckoos is not enshrined in grand monuments, but in the quiet recognition of their audacity. They remind us that history is not just made by generals and grand offensives, but by the desperate, clever, and ultimately human actions of those in the crucible of combat. They were a fleeting, brilliant anomaly, a secret that succeeded so well that it nearly erased itself, leaving behind only a ghost of an image and a legacy of turning the enemy's greatest strength into his most devastating weakness.